Nearly 5,000 helicopter crew members were killed in Vietnam. 2,165 pilots and 2,712 crew members died in the war. Among them, door gunners had some of the highest casualty rates. They stood in open doorways at 3,000 feet, completely exposed to enemy fire, with only a 23-pound machine gun and a monkey strap keeping them from falling out. Their job was to provide suppressive fire while inserting troops into hot landing zones. But the reality of what they faced was far worse than most people realize. And now, you are going to see why. When people talk about the Vietnam War, they usually mention the Tet Offensive or the Fall of Saigon. But the real story of that war was written in the AIR. Vietnam became the first helicopter war in history, and the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, better known as the Huey, became its most iconic symbol. By March 1970, more than 3,900 helicopters were operating in Vietnam, and 2/3 of them were Hueys. The sound of their rotor blades, that distinctive whoop, 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 became the soundtrack of the war for both American troops and Vietnamese civilians. But for the men standing in those open doors with M60 machine guns, that sound meant something entirely different. It meant they were about to become the most visible target on the battlefield. The Army needed the Huey because Vietnam was unlike any war they had fought before. The jungle was so dense that traditional ground movement was almost impossible. Roads were few and constantly mined or ambushed. The enemy, both Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnamese Army regulars, knew the terrain perfectly and could disappear into tunnel systems or thick vegetation within seconds. The solution was air mobility. Instead of moving troops slowly through the jungle where they could be ambushed at any moment, helicopters could insert entire companies deep into enemy territory in minutes. The concept was revolutionary. A Huey could carry 6 to 8 American soldiers or 10 or more Vietnamese troops, formations of helicopters. Flying so tight that their rotors nearly overlapped, these helicopters could move an entire battalion to the battlefield faster than any previous method in military history. But this new tactic created a new problem. These unarmed transport helicopters, called slicks because they lacked external weapons, were extraordinarily vulnerable during the most critical moments of any mission. As they approached a landing zone, they had to slow down, descend, and hover just above the ground while troops jumped out. During those few seconds, they were sitting ducks. The enemy quickly learned where helicopters were most vulnerable. They would wait silently as the first wave approached, then open fire with everything they had the moment the helicopters began to land. Small arms fire, automatic weapons, and heavy machine guns would all concentrate on the slow-moving targets. A single well-placed bullet could bring down a Huey. The fuel tanks were particularly vulnerable, as were the transmission and hydraulic systems. Even minor damage to the tail rotor could make a helicopter uncontrollable. That is where the door gunners came in. Every Huey had at least 2, one on each side. Originally, these positions were filled by crew chiefs who served dual roles as both mechanics and gunners. As the war intensified, a second soldier was added specifically for the door gunner role. Many were volunteers from infantry units who thought flying would be safer than walking through the jungle. They could not have been more wrong. The door gunner's job was to provide suppressive fire during the approach to the landing zone and during extraction. In theory, their machine gun fire would keep enemy heads down long enough for troops to get off the helicopter and for the pilot to lift away. In practice, it meant standing in an open doorway, completely exposed, firing at an enemy that was specifically targeting them. The weapon they used was the M60 machine gun. It weighed 23 pounds and fired 7.62 mm NATO rounds at a rate of about 550 rounds per minute. The gun was belt-fed, and door gunners typically had access to around 1,000 rounds, though many carried double that amount despite regulations. The M60 could be mounted on a pintle mount that swiveled, or as the war progressed, many gunners preferred to use bungee cords to suspend the weapon. This gave them more flexibility in their firing angles. Some door gunners simply hand-wielded the weapon for maximum maneuverability, a technique called using a free 60. A canvas bag was attached to the gun to catch ejected brass casings and links. Without it, the spent casings could be sucked into the rotor blades or engine intakes with catastrophic results. But the technical specifications of the weapon tell you nothing about what it was actually like to use it. Door gunners had to lean out of a helicopter, moving at speeds of up to 140 miles per hour, sometimes just a few feet above the jungle canopy. The rotor wash was incredible. The noise was deafening. The vibration made accurate fire nearly impossible. And all of this was happening while enemy tracers were coming up from the tree line, looking for them specifically. Door gunners wore monkey straps, essentially safety harnesses, to keep them from falling out when the helicopter banked hard or took evasive action. But these straps also meant that if the helicopter was hit and going down, the gunner had precious seconds to unclip, or he would go down with it. There are documented cases of door gunners trapped in their harnesses as helicopters crashed and burned. The exposure was constant and terrifying. Unlike soldiers on the ground who could take cover behind trees or in foxholes, door gunners had no protection whatsoever. The helicopters had no armor plating on the sides. A door gunner standing in that opening presented a target roughly 6 feet tall and 2 feet wide. At the altitudes, helicopters typically flew during combat assaults between 500 and 1,000 feet on approach. That was an easy shot for experienced enemy gunners. North Vietnamese forces were trained to aim for the most exposed crew members first. They knew that taking out the door gunners made the helicopter even more vulnerable. Intelligence reports from captured enemy soldiers confirmed this was standard doctrine. The bright orange tracers from door gunner fire also gave away their exact position. Once a gunner opened fire, every enemy soldier in the area knew exactly where to aim. The missions themselves followed a brutal pattern. A typical combat assault would begin with artillery preparation of the landing zone. Howitzers would fire 105mm shells into and around the target area. Then gunship helicopters, armed with rockets and miniguns, would make passes over the landing zone, suppressing any remaining enemy positions. The door gunners on the transport slicks would watch all of this happen as their formation approached. They could see the smoke, the explosions, the tracers coming up. And they knew that in about 30 seconds, they would be flying right through the middle of it. As the formation descended toward the landing zone, typically from an altitude of 3,000 feet, the door gunners would fire their weapons. Short bursts to make sure everything was working. At 1,000 feet, they would usually start taking fire. Sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but it was almost always inevitable on a hot landing zone. The sound of rounds hitting the helicopter was distinctive. Metallic pings for small arms, louder cracks for heavier weapons. Door gunners learned to distinguish them instantly. They would return fire at the muzzle flashes below, trying to suppress enemy positions long enough for their helicopter to land and unload. The worst moment was the hover. When the Huey slowed to drop troops, it became nearly stationary for several seconds. During that time, every enemy weapon in range would concentrate fire on it. Door gunners would be firing continuously, burning through ammunition at an incredible rate. The barrel of an M60 could glow red hot after sustained fire. The slipstream from the rotor blades helped cool it, but door gunners were trained to fire in controlled bursts to prevent the weapon from overheating or having rounds cook off in the chamber. Still, on intense missions, weapons would jam from heat or fouling, leaving the gunner frantically trying to clear the malfunction while under fire. Then there were the casualties. Door gunners sat right next to the troop compartment. When a helicopter took fire, they watched soldiers get hit. They saw the blood, the wounds, the chaos. Sometimes they had to pull injured men back into the helicopter during extraction under fire. Sometimes they watched men they had just inserted get cut down. Before the helicopter even lifted away, the psychological impact was immense. Unlike infantry, who might see heavy combat occasionally, door gunners flew multiple missions per day. An average assault helicopter crew might participate in 2 or 3 combat assaults in a few hours. Each one was a roll of the dice. The casualty statistics tell the story. Between 1966 and 1971, one Army helicopter was lost for every 7.9 sorties. 564 pilots, 1,155 crewmen, and 682 passengers were killed in accidents alone, not counting combat losses. In total, approximately 5,000 helicopters were destroyed in Vietnam. Over 3,000 of those were Hueys. But beyond the statistics were the individual stories. There are cases of door gunners who continued firing even after being wounded, knowing that if they stopped, the entire crew and the troops they were carrying could die. Records show instances of door gunners who took multiple hits but stayed at their guns until the helicopter cleared the landing zone. Some died at their posts, slumped over their weapons, still strapped in. Others were blown out of the aircraft by explosions or heavy fire. The stress manifested in different ways. Some door gunners became hyper-vigilant, unable to relax even when back at base. Others developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when so many others died. The rotation system made it worse. Crew members would see new door gunners arrive, bright and eager, only to watch them get killed or badly wounded within their first weeks. It became difficult to form close relationships when the danger was so constant. The equipment had its own set of dangers. M60 machine guns in Vietnam were notorious for mechanical problems. The harsh jungle environment, with its heat, humidity, and constant moisture, caused frequent jams. The weapon was prone to failures in extraction, where spent casings would not eject properly. The barrel latch lever protruded awkwardly and could catch on equipment, accidentally releasing the barrel mid-flight. Most critically, the sear, the part that held the bolt back until the trigger was pulled, would wear down quickly. This resulted in what was called a runaway gun, where the weapon would continue firing even after the gunner released the trigger. The only way to stop it was to break the ammunition belt or let it fire until empty. To make matters worse, there was no standardized training program for door gunners early in the war. Many learned on the job, flying actual combat missions with experienced gunners showing them the basics. Later, more formal training was established, but even then, nothing could truly prepare someone for the reality of combat. You could not simulate the fear, the noise, the confusion, or the knowledge that at any moment a bullet could end your life. The helicopters themselves offered no protection, unlike the armored vehicles used on. On the ground, Hueys were made of thin aluminum. The doors were wide open by design to allow rapid insertion and extraction of troops. Some crews tried to improvise protection, stacking sandbags on the floor or wearing extra body armor. But the additional weight affected the helicopter's performance, reducing its speed and maneuverability. Pilots often insisted that armor be removed because the performance penalty was too great. so door gunners remained exposed. As the war progressed, tactics evolved in response to mounting casualties. Helicopter formations became more sophisticated. Instead of flying in tight groups that made easy targets, pilots learned to vary their approach patterns and use terrain masking whenever possible. They would fly low, just above the treetops, using the jungle canopy as cover until the last possible moment before climbing to the landing zone. This technique, called nap of the earth flying, made them harder to track but also more vulnerable to small arms fire from close range. Door gunners had to adjust their techniques constantly, scanning the jungle canopy below for muzzle flashes while also watching for threats at their altitude. The relationship between door gunners and pilots was critical to survival. Good pilots listened to their door gunners. The gunners had a better view of what was happening on the flanks and rear of the aircraft. They would call out threats, direct evasive maneuvers, and provide critical information during approaches and departures. Many pilots credited their door gunners with saving their lives by spotting threats. The pilots could not see from the cockpit. This created a bond of absolute trust. Door gunners knew their lives depended on the pilot's skill. Pilots knew that without effective door gunners providing suppressive fire, their chances of making it through a hot landing zone dropped dramatically. The physical toll on door gunners was severe. The constant exposure to rotor wash, engine noise, and weapon fire caused hearing damage. Many door gunners suffered permanent hearing loss. The vibration from hours of flying caused joint problems and back pain. The stress of combat took a psychological toll that would only become fully understood decades later. But at the time, door gunners were expected to simply keep flying, mission after mission, day after day, until their tour was over or they became casualties. Despite all of this, the job had to be done. Air mobility was the foundation of American tactics in Vietnam. Without door gunners providing suppressive fire, the casualty rates for helicopter assaults would have been even higher. They were essential to the mission, and they knew it. Many door gunners took pride in their work, in their ability to protect their aircraft and the troops they carried. There was a strong sense of camaraderie between helicopter crews and the infantry. The infantry knew that the fear and vulnerability they felt occasionally going into hot landing zones was an almost daily occurrence for the flight crews. The crews knew that the infantry lived in constant danger in the field. Exposed to ambush and harsh conditions, this mutual respect created bonds that lasted long after the war. The legacy of the Huey door gunners is one of extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. They stood in open doorways at thousands of feet, with nothing but a machine gun and a harness, and they did their jobs mission after mission. They saved countless lives by providing the covering fire that allowed helicopters to insert and extract troops. They were the thin line between a successful mission and a catastrophe, and they paid for it with casualty rates that reflected the brutal reality of their position. Today, the image of a door gunner leaning out of a Huey M60 blazing has become one of the most iconic images of the Vietnam War. But behind that image was a young man, often just 19 or 20 years old, who faced death multiple times per day. Many did not survive their tour. Others came home with wounds, both physical and psychological, that would never fully heal. Their story is one of sacrifice that deserves to be remembered and honored. If you want to hear more stories like this, help us out by subscribing.